Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the Breakfast Club. It's Saturday, so you know what that means. I'm your host, Sage. So, got another round robin topic, and it's a good one. Brought up by Cirrus Mind. He's put out a really good video on the topic. So has JJ Talks and Nathan as well. And I am really hoping that my video can measure up to theirs because they've come up with some really interesting things so far. And the topic is on the generation gap. Whether we can bridge it, should we even bother bridging it, or is it even possible to try to bridge the gap between the younger and older generations? What could be causing the problem between the two? So, as somebody who's caught in the middle, because I'm 40 years old, so I'd be technically Generation X, I guess. I definitely have my own opinions on this. This may mirror some of what has already been said, but I hope it's different enough. I hope I come up with a different enough angle to warrant some further discussion on things, a new way of looking at it. I'm personally thinking that as far as bridging the gap goes, I think it's worth trying to do it just for the sake of human society and improving it and, generally, better relations between the younger and older generations. Because if you want a society to function, everyone needs to be able to get along more or less. But I think there's two major things keeping that from happening, like two stumbling blocks. One is the fact that, well, when it comes to younger and older generations in society, there's always going to be some form of butting heads. That's one of the problems. It's just this constant cliche. And the other thing is, fairly recently, I would say that you start seeing this kind of building up, from a certain time period all the way up until now. Like I was gonna say from the '60s onward, but for reasons I'll get into later, I'd rather put it a little bit later than that. It's like around the '80s all the way up. There's this inflexibility that we're seeing growing more and more between the younger and older generations, particularly on ideological lines. And this is really making the gap wider and wider. To start with the first reason I brought up, the fact that this is just this constant problem that we're going to have to deal with. It's just this natural thing in society. It's pretty much become cliche that there's just going to be some things that the younger and the older generations are just going to keep butting heads about. We've written songs about it. We have stories about it. We tell jokes about it. You see it throughout history. It's just this constant thing where there's just some things the younger generation is going to see that the older generation isn't going to necessarily see. There's some things that one group is going to be considered to be good, and the other group is like, that's abhorrent. Like, there's just some things that they're just not going to be able to see eye to eye on. Sometimes it's just out of straight up misunderstanding it or just not having an appreciation for it. Like, music is a good example. We could always talk about how the older generation has a form of music that they fondly remember, that they cling to, that they say this is classic stuff, this takes talent. And the younger generation will find boring unless they're really into music and they can get something out of it, but then they got their own form of it, and then the older ones like, what the hell is this noise? And there you go. Right there, you got a butting of heads. A different type of cultural appreciation there. Language, speech techniques, slang terms, you'll see a change in that, which can cause a butting of heads. How we deal with one another. Human culture is always changing. It's always evolving. It's always, moving on to something else. And when you reach a point where you are kind of stuck with the culture you grew up with and you're not necessarily willing or able, depending on how you want to look at it, to kind of stick with a newer way of doing things because you're kind of comfortable with what you're with, you're not necessarily going to accept or even like, what's coming up after you. You can't really relate with the lingo or the culture or, the value systems or whatever. So there's going to be that sort of problem. I will, however, say that can be mitigated by two things. One, how willing the younger generation is to share this stuff with the older generation, and how much the older generation is willing to accept some of that. They're not going to necessarily be able to accept all of it. Nobody can accept all of one thing that somebody else likes. Even within a generation, sometimes, there's only so much of somebody else's likes that you're willing to take upon yourself. But there has to at least be an openness to it, like with the younger generation to share it and the older generation to accept it, and vice versa. And also a willingness for the older generation to grow along with the younger generation. One of the big problems that the older generation tends to forget is that for all their talk about, oh, well, elders need to be respected, which is a constant theme throughout many different societies. The older generation has a certain amount of life experience that the younger generation should be able to glean from. There's a certain amount of, life experience that needs to be respected. And that's true to an extent, but the problem is we don't know it all. For all this talk about human experience, like, we've reached a certain age and we have a certain amount of experience that you guys need to learn from. There's certain universal, for lack of a better term, there's certain universal truths about human society that it can more or less be able to pass on to a younger generation, and it'll more or less, survive the tests of time. It's proven it. So, like, problems with relationships, for instance, how to keep those things going. Certain forms of morality, what works, what doesn't, how to manage money, how to manage the society, the concept of responsibility, things like that. You more or less can see that kind of more or less being the same year to year, decade to decade, century to century, so on, and even throughout different cultures to an extent. But we don't know it all. There's never really been a point in human society where we've learned it all. And because of that, you have to, as an older person, respect the new discoveries of the younger generation. In fact, so many of the things that human society benefits from, like all the improvements, usually come from the younger generation. The older generation's holding on to an older time period, an older way of thinking, which may be outdated after a certain period of time. The passion to explore and do new things you usually see in the younger generation, which means they're making discoveries which may supplant old, outdated information. And this information isn't just with technology and science, but also ethics, morality, how we view one another, even how governments may work and what the responsibilities they may have with the people that they're governing. The older generation will lose sight of that if they get too complacent, if they stop growing, if they stop learning. And this is something that unfortunately you see a lot of because they get complacent. So that's one of the obstacles that needs to be overcome, getting over that complacency, which again is a common thing. It's a common pitfall for human society to fall for, which goes right along with that whole thing of the younger and older generations. Inevitably there's going to be a butting of heads. But as long as one group is willing to grow and the other group is willing to at least listen to and kind of, accept what the older group is saying, while at the same time being willing to share what they've learned, and the older generation being willing to accept the new information and grow along with them, while at the same time being able to pass down old wisdom, and there's like that back and forth and that kind of compromise there, that obstacle can be overcome. But what's keeping that from happening is the second stumbling block that I mentioned, which is that inflexibility, which has so many different ties to culture, to our economic environment. There's been more and more of this divide coming from ideological inflexibility between the different groups. The older groups tend to be considered to be more conservative, which is more or less true. And the younger groups tend to be a bit more liberal for reasons that Nathan had already discussed. In fact, the other two had discussed as well, JJ Talks and Serious Mind. I'm not going to be getting into those reasons here. What I will say is that those ideological divides are there, and because of the hardships that the younger generation is going through, they're not willing to bend anymore. And I don't blame them. In fact, I feel that there's certain things that they should not have to bend, certain ideological things that they shouldn't bend on at all. But there's an inflexibility when it comes to at least trying to come up with a way to bring this about. And remember, for all their anger and for all they're willing to fight the powers that be, the power is still more or less in the hands of the older generation. And short of a straight up revolution, the only way you're going to be able to get some of these new things to be brought in is to find some form of compromise, which the older group isn't willing to do because, oh, you guys are just lazy. Or you guys just don't understand, despite the fact that these are the people who are actually educating themselves and coming up with new discoveries. There's no respect for newer knowledge, but they want respect for older knowledge that may be outdated. So that's causing a problem right there. And it also doesn't help that much of the older generation, in my personal opinion, I'm going to have to come out and say it, don't really deserve the respect that they want to begin with. A lot of the older generations are part of the baby boomers. And if I'm going to be going into my problem with the baby boomers, that will be a subject for a whole nother video. And I'll be here for like 20 minutes ranting about the ideas they betrayed, that how they made a complete 180 and ended up being the very monsters that they claimed that they were fighting against. Like if I go into it, I'm just going to rant and yell, and I don't need to get into that here. Suffice to say that in terms of trying to come up with stuff that could basically build a better world for their children and their grandchildren and descendants, they're not doing a very good job of it, no matter how much they may be claiming otherwise. And the younger ones know this, and they're having to bear the burden of those decisions. It is a fact that this younger group of people they're deeper in debt, they're struggling to make ends meet in ways that the baby boomer generation did not have to do as a whole, and yet they're being told that they're lazy because they want to break from that. They're being told that they don't understand the real world when they're having to deal with the brunt of it while they're still trying to go to college and get their degrees, which the generation that's pointing the fingers at them didn't really have to deal with or had an easier time dealing with. They had bigger grants. They had an easier time getting through college. They had parents that had money to get them through there. This group doesn't, for the most part. I know we can come up with examples of groups of people in the younger generations that do, but the numbers are there. The statistics are there for anybody willing to look them up. They know that they're getting screwed, the younger generation. And the older generation just doesn't want to hear it. And that's where the animosity comes in. That's where, the ideological inflexibility comes in. Because the younger ones are getting screwed and they're pissed and they're tired of having to listen to, well, you need to respect what I'm saying. They're like, no, fuck you. I don't. I've had it with you. And the older generation is like, well, you're supposed to be respecting me. And it's not happening, so they get mad. And they don't want to bend because these guys are trying to change things in a way that they think is going to completely destroy their world. They're not willing to listen. And then you got my generation stuck in the middle, which didn't really have the power that this newer one does. The Gen X group, many of them were just as, and still are, as mad as the millennials, but we didn't have the internet back then to form groups that could actually effectively fight back against, the older group that we felt was screwing us. Still feel in some ways that we still could have found a way to overcome if we were willing to put our minds to it, but again, that's another topic. Suffice to say, this newer group has better power now. They're more technologically savvy. They got the internet and social media to help them organize, to help them, get their ideas across. And now it's just a matter of, can they do it? The problem is, I think that the main way they're going to be able to do it is through compromise. I mean, not on everything. Some things they shouldn't compromise on. But there still has to be a certain point where you're going to have to reach out to some people and, across the divide, the older generations, and find a way to at least communicate the ideas. Both groups have certain fears that they're dealing with. If they can at least be able to explain these fears to each other and then find a way to alleviate them, that could go a long way. Because I will say this, because this video is already getting too long. Many of the problems that both the older and younger generations are having with the way society is going are actually match up. If they could just find a way to communicate that to each other and they realize that in many ways they're kind of on the same side, that can go a long way. But that means putting down the inflexibility a little bit and being willing to bend. And because of our current political climate, no one really wants to bend because they already feel that they're being screwed already. When you already feel that you've given up too much to begin with, you're not going to be willing to surrender anything anymore. And that climate is helping to keep that gap wide. So it's going to take a whole lot of... Basically, it's going to take a whole lot of courage to put themselves in that vulnerable spot to being willing to bend for the other just enough so that they can come up with a way to bridge that gap. Will they do it? I don't know. Okay, that's all I'm going to say because this is now 15 minutes. Hope you guys got something out of it, and I'll catch you guys later.